I feel like we were born into a world which, for some of us at any rate, had been cushioned for generations, been cushioned on oil, it had been cushioned on the ongoing unfinished legacies of colonialism, all of these things which made possible ways of life that were held up as some inevitable, desirable, irreversible trajectory towards cities, towards technology, towards the future that was meant to be filled with promise. And then those promises began to fray. And they were probably already fraying and starting to unravel for a lot of people, even in the world of my childhood. And that experience has reached more and more people. And part of what happens as that unraveling comes along is that the shadow side of that world, the things that were hidden by the shine of its promises, comes into view. And for a long time, I went around talking to people about climate change, and that was kind of at the center of the work that I was doing. And I realized that that was partly because that for the people who have been most insulated from the shadow side of that world that held so much promise, climate change is often the place where the shiny surface cracks. It's the place where people's confidence that we can fix everything, that we can keep things on a sort of Hans Rosling and Steven Pinker trajectory unravels, and they find themselves shaken, often shaken to the core. And from there, it becomes possible to enter into a larger set of conversations. And yet, over the years, I've become a little less sure of the way in which climate change can open that door to those larger and deeper conversations, partly because there've been more money and more resources and more mainstream attention on climate change in the last few years. And you might say, well, great, people are finally listening, they're finally taking it seriously. But the risk is that the way of taking it seriously is a doubling down on the logics of the very world that is unraveling, the very set of promises that cannot be kept. And meanwhile, I look back at what happens when those promises start to unravel, and I feel like part of what is revealed is the strange cultural poverty that accompanies the unprecedented material wealth that was at the heart of the promises of that way of living, that story of progress. There have probably never been human beings living with such scarcity of beauty and meaning and skill as has been normal. Or another way of saying it is to say that meaning has a lot to do with consequences, an awareness of relationships, an awareness of what we're entangled with, an awareness of what my actions do to you and to people I will never meet. And part of what that world of progress and development did was to propel us to a point where to try and be genuinely aware of the consequences of our ways of living, the costs of it, is paralyzing. To participate in these late modern societies of consumption almost requires you to dissociate from the consequences and the costs of the ways that you're living, the lives of people you will never meet who are mining the coltan that goes into your phones or working in the factories where those phones are put together. And this was all kind of held in place for a while by the promise that, where we are now, everyone else will be soon. That promise was never true, but it's unraveling further. And that's part of where the scarcity of meaning comes from, because if we have, in order to participate in these societies and these ways of being human together, had to detach ourselves from the consequences and costs of our ways of living to an extent that was until recently the privilege of mad emperors. Those were the only people who got to live with this level of dissociation. But actually, part of where the madness comes from is that when we no longer know, or when we cannot bear to look at the costs and consequences of how we're living, then our lives lack meaning, because meaning is all to do with consequence. It's all to do with cost. It's often the costliest experiences in life that are the points at which we're thrown beyond the surface, the things that were meant to be the goals in life, into the hardness, into the difficulty, into the place where we discover what matters to us, we discover who matters to us. And all of that is part of what we were insulated against by this culture of consumption. And this culture, which is barely worth the name of culture, it's unraveling, it's coming to an end. Vast efforts are being made to sustain and extend it. I sometimes say that what we're witnessing is a little bit like a machine that is running faster and faster and pieces are flying off it. And so you can see, on the one hand, the faster and faster, you can see the intensification and the extension of the logics of that machine. And at the same moment, the pieces are flying off and people are being hit by them. And that's part of the story of what's going on in our societies. And you sort of need an image like that in order to make sense of how it can both be true. That, as I've been saying, things are fraying and unraveling, and we can have the evidence that people can point to of things intensifying, going further along these trajectories at the same time. I remember Vinay Gupta coming to the first Dark Mountain Festival in 2010 and looking out over this very white, very middle-class environmentalist audience and saying, "What you people call collapse is living in the same conditions as the people who grow your coffee." And as a first attempt to unsettle the conversations that we fall into when a word like collapse enters the room, it was a helpful provocation. It's the one line that everyone remembers from that weekend. And for a few years, I did go around talking about collapse, and Vinay and I and a few friends had this thing called the Institute for Collapsonomics. And in the beginning of Dark Mountain, when we wrote the manifesto, there was that line that's always been brought back to me by people: "The end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world, full stop." And over the years, I realized that it's very hard for people to hear that language and not get locked into a kind of Hollywood vision of, the morning when the newspaper says it's the end of the world as we know it, the day when everything breaks and nothing is the same again. And I'm not trying to claim some certainty that such a day can never come, but I think it's probably truer to say the collapse is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so what I realized over the years was, in order to allow what I'm trying to think about and talk about when I speak about those things to land, sometimes a gentler language is needed in order to make the space in which people can hear and feel it. So I found myself talking about what it means to be living in a time of endings, because I think that that's a true way of naming where we find ourselves. And then this language of ruins came from various directions, and came from the subtitle of Anna Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, which is on the possibilities of life among capitalist ruins. And I thought, yeah, that's a thing, to go looking for the possibilities of life among the ruins of systems that are failing and will not be repaired. And then when I was almost at the end of writing this book, which the book didn't know it was going to be called At Work in the Ruins until it was finished, but this language was starting to come to the fore. And then I came across the work of Federico Campagna, this Italian philosopher, and there was something I heard in what he was saying. He doesn't word it quite like this, but I had the chance to sit down with him and I said, "This is what I've been going around telling people. I hope I've got it right." And he said, yeah, you get it. So what I heard in his work was this: sometimes you're born into the ending of a world. This is a thing that happens. It's happened to others before you in other times and places. A sign of being born into the ending of a world is that the future, in the ordinary sense, no longer works. Because when a politician stands up and makes a speech and tries to mobilize collective hope around the future in that sense is a line drawn from the recent past through the present, onwards in a trajectory full of promise. And at the ending of a world, as Federico says, when you're in the ending of a world, the story of that world doesn't have much left to run. So when someone tries to extend that story, when they try to extend that line into the future, it no longer rings true. People can feel that at a gut level without necessarily being able to articulate or analyze it. And so what you might find in such a time is that instead, the people who are able to make political capital are the ones who speak not to the future, but to the past. And I think of the British journalist Anthony Barnett in the book that he wrote about the political events of 2016 in both the UK and the US. He said, you know, the most important words in the slogans of that year were back and again. Take back control. Make America great again. It's the potency of appealing to the past in a time where the story we're in doesn't have much left to run. And so Federico Campagna, he says, well, what's worth doing if it is your discernment that you were born into such a time? And he says, first, stop worrying so much about needing to make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending. And then look for ways to make good ruins. And I've been chewing on those phrases. I found myself, it happens sometimes, you get something that's just stuck in your mouth, and every conversation, every interview, every talk, these words keep coming back. And as you chew on them over months and years, they release things that you didn't see at first. And so I've begun to see in that, you know, stop worrying about making sense according to the logic of the world that is ending. Okay, who are the people who for one reason or another either never worried so much about making sense according to the logic of the world that we were born into, or have found the tricks and hacks and the foolish moves that allow you to slip out and around the edges of that logic? Or even who are the actors who hold resources within the games of that world, who can see that it is ending and who are looking for ways to do something with the resources that they hold that might contribute to the possibility of there being worlds worth living for on the far side at this ending. And so then that becomes part of the making good ruins, because what is a ruin? It's something that's broken out of what was a whole structure. The structures of a world that comes to an end don't just vanish without trace. They leave traces, they leave ruins, and the people who are making lives in the aftermath break things loose from the ruins of the old imperial buildings and use them to make humbler homes in the place where the empire once stood. I feel like that's the work that's coming over the horizon now, is finding these strange alliances of people who for one reason or another can see around the edges of the logic of the world we were born into and can tell other stories into the space of those ruins, such that something new, something, as my friend Vanessa Andreotti says, something unknown, possibly but not necessarily wiser, can be brought into the world. We can assist with the birth of that alongside hospicing the old systems and structures that cannot last that much longer, that cannot be made sustainable, and that were anyway founded on this shadow side of the destruction of culture and the devastation of ecology that was always part of the backstory to industrial modernity for all of its achievements. It's worth saying something about the achievements of modernity, because when we begin to speak about, in Vanessa's language, hospicing modernity, it can be heard as if we're saying we want to bring it all down, plough it all into the soil go back. There is no going back, you know, for all of its achievements and all of its innovations. The technological trajectory of modernity has yet to produce a time machine. We don't have any option of going back, but we can listen more humbly to what the ways in which humans have made life work and continue to make life work in other times and places have to tell us, have to show us about what was missing from, what we were blind to within the logics of the world that said that it was, you know, we are the ones who live closest to the future and everyone else will be here soon. Like stepping down from the arrogance of that position into a place where we can hear and see what others have been trying to show us. That's part of what's called for. But that doesn't mean that we, you know, pronounce an anathema on all of the things that were achieved within the last 7 generations or the last 5 centuries of the project of Western modernity. I say at the end of the book, I can see at least 4 kinds of work, 4 kinds of tasks that make sense in an age of endings. The first is to look for the good things that are worth salvaging from the systems and structures and world that is ending, and the work of bringing with us what we can carry. And then there's the work of mourning the good things that we're not going to be able to bring with us. And the work of mourning includes telling the stories, singing the songs. Some of those stories of things that we lost will turn out to be seeds in worlds that we can't imagine yet. Then there's a work of discernment, which is noticing the things that were never as good as we told each other they were, about the way we've been doing life around here lately. And the chance that we're given to see them more clearly because of the angle of the light at that kind of twilight moment when something is ending. You know, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. There's an ability to see and to name things and to choose to walk away from them instead of trying to sustain them and defend them at all costs when maybe they were actually quite counterproductive all along. So that's the third kind of work, is that discernment. And the fourth kind of task is to notice the dropped threads, the things that were marked as old-fashioned, obsolete, inefficient, or just were not legible at all, couldn't be seen in ways that allowed them to be taken seriously within the logics of the world that is ending. That we have a chance to pick up and weave back into the story of how we make lives together on the journey that we're on. So that definitely doesn't exhaust the kinds of tasks, the kinds of work that are called for in these times, but those are some of the trajectories that I see that are worth applying ourselves to. After the book came out, one of the things that surprised and delighted me was that there's a man called Richard Smith who was formerly the editor of the British Medical Journal. And so he's been very much at the centre of the medical and health establishment in the UK and internationally. And he's retired now. And he read the book and he wrote a lengthy review of it in the pages of the BMJ. But the bit that excited me was in the latter part of the review, he took those 4 tasks for an age of endings, that kind of map of salvaging the good, mourning, the discernment of what was never as good as we said it was, and the picking up of the lost threads. And he said, well, right, here's my suggestion of which things within medicine are good that we have a chance of taking with us, which are good things that we're not going to manage to take with us into the kinds of worlds we're headed towards, which are the things that were never as good as we told everyone they were, and where are the things we left out of our whole picture within Western medicine that we badly need to bring back into the picture if we're going to make lives worth living in the times ahead. And that was amazing to me, that somebody could bring his 50 years of experience in the medical and health establishment and use this back of an envelope tool that I sketched out in the closing pages of the book to try and start a different kind of conversation within his professional field. And I've seen people starting to take that same list and use it for conversations in all sorts of worlds over the last year or so. So I guess that's part of what I'm trying to do, is just give people language, images, tools, Maps in that kind of humble sense of the map that you draw for a friend around the kitchen table in a late night conversation, that make it possible to start other conversations, to have different lenses through which to look at where we find ourselves, what we know and what we have good grounds to fear about the depth of the trouble we're in, and what's worth doing in the light of all of that. So when we start to talk about worlds have ended before, many worlds were ended by people who look like me, going around the planet and building the modern, colonial, interconnected economy and society that we're starting out from, that we are in some sense witnessing the ending of. So many worlds were ended in the name of progress. And there's a sense that what's going on now, the anthropologists Mario Blaser and Marisol de la Cadena say this. They say all this talk about the Anthropocene from cities like Berlin, Stockholm, Washington, heard from elsewhere, sounds a lot like the world of the powerful becoming sensitive to the possibility that its world too could end, after having gone around the world and ended so many other people's worlds in the name of progress, development, liberal democracy, globalization, all of the rest of it. So then people say, well, okay, but this time it's different. It's what they say in the world of investment, isn't it? Never believe when someone says this time it's different. That's the sure sign that you're in a bubble. But of course, there are differences. There are differences in what is at stake. We're in a profound ecological crisis. But it's also different in the sense that the people who are living the ending of this world are helpless in a way that has never been seen before. What we became on the journey through industrial modernity was a new kind of human being, lacking in the skills and capacities at the level of the person, the household, and the community, which humans everywhere until recently had to have. Every human community until quite recently had the capacity to grow its own food and feed itself, to build its own homes, to care for its own sick, to bury its own dying. Those capacities were part of all human cultures. And what we have done is to de-skill ourselves in that, to locate those skills within professions and industries that leave us strangely helpless. And the person who brought all of this into view for me was Ivan Illich in his writing. And he was telling these stories, and he was writing these books from Cuernavaca in Mexico in the early 1970s, narrating this. And then I came across a book by somebody else who had passed through Mexico around the same time on his way to Guatemala, Martin Prechtel, who had grown up on a Pueblo reservation in New Mexico. And in his late teens, he'd been through the initiations with the old men who were the traditionalists within that culture. And he tells this story, it's a very funny story, kind of telling it against himself, of when he arrived in the village. And firstly, he's like, this place. Okay, I found where I want to be. And so he's going around trying to find anyone, and it's a huge village. It's a village of 25,000 people. He's trying to find anyone who speaks Spanish because he doesn't speak the local language. And then he's saying to them, I want to find a house to rent. And they're saying, sorry, we don't understand. You want to pay someone money to live in their house, but where are they going to live? Or you want to live in a house on your own with no elders and no children and no women. Why would you want to live like that? You need a house. Well, why don't you build it? He says, well, I don't know how to. And he says, well, why don't you get your father and your mother and your uncles to help you build a house? And he says, well, I don't really have any family who are around. And they say, now we understand. You're an orphan. And they found a category to describe the helplessness of this human being who has arrived from further north, from even having grown up in an indigenous community, but from somewhere more deeply incorporated into the structures of modernity and the helplessness that it produces. And so that's a kind of vivid image of how strange the helplessness that is the consequence of the ways of organizing life that we've had in modernity looks when seen from elsewhere. And so when we put this into the context of hospicing modernity, of navigating the ending of a world, I guess it means that one of the things that's most needed is the humbling experience of picking up the dropped threads of skills that we were educated to believe that people like us didn't need to have. I think of the Irish philosopher John Moriarty, who grew up in rural Ireland, I guess probably in the 1940s, and he says somewhere, you know, in the world that I grew up in, if one morning we'd woken up and everybody over the age of 14 was gone, the rest of us could have run the farms, we could have kept our villages going, we could have fed ourselves and met our needs. And he says, and then I went off into the world of university and became a philosopher, and from there, the world of my childhood was a world that was characterized by ignorance. Those of us who are coming out of the world of the highly developed countries, the world of late modernity, and onto this path, we find ourselves in remedial class. You know, we're stumbling in our 40s or whatever age we are, into trying to learn skills which, in many of the worlds in which humans have made life work together, everyone had by the age of 8. And part of why I name that is to, we have to cut ourselves some slack in the sense of recognizing that we are going to feel foolish and clumsy, and we have to get okay with that. We have to be willing to roll around in the cowshed and make fools of ourselves. And something that is a blessing can happen when you see people go on that journey, when you see people who have, won lots of the games of modernity, who've got the multiple degrees and the CV points, who are willing to go to that point of being humbled and learning from people who, according to the logic of that world, belong to the ignorant, but who are far more deeply skilled in many of the practical things that we're going to need to make life work together. And I'm actually meeting more and more people who are on that path, and I think that part of what they're doing is modeling the possibility that even for us, even for the foolish, unskilled winners of the games of modernity, if we're willing to make fools of ourselves, if we're willing to laugh at ourselves alongside the people we find ourselves with, and if we're willing to roll up our sleeves and get dirt under our fingernails, there are paths beyond the ending of the world in which we were educated and schooled and trained to look for success. When I talk about modernity, I think about it like this. There's this strange window of time and space within which it seemed natural to certain people to think of our proximity to the future as the best and most significant thing about us. So to think of yourself as modern is to identify by being we're the ones who live closest to the future. And that becomes thinkable in cities like Paris and London in the late 17th and into the 18th century. And gradually the logic of that extends and reaches and encloses more and more of the life of the world. And so you get this phenomenon of modernity, which is the phenomenon of those who have confidence in the proximity to the future, which is the logic of progress, which is the logic of development. And what you also see is that certainly by the time that I was born, that confidence is already being shaken. And so there's this academic talk that comes from, again, from cities like Paris, postmodernism, which gets going in the 1970s. And I'm not much interested in those schools of thought, but just as a symptom, the fact that talk of post-modernity and postmodernism comes along at that moment in time reflects something wider that is going on, which is that the confidence in the future, the confidence in proximity to the future is being shaken, partly by the failure of political projects of the left, but strongly by the impact of the environmentalism of the 1960s and 70s and the news that is coming from the front lines of scientific research about the costs and consequences of the industrial mode of life. And so, by the time of my childhood, we were tilting into a world where the future was no longer a vessel for collective hope, but a source of anxiety, something from which we want to distract ourselves. And so that's the symptoms of the postmodern condition, is a world in which it no longer works when people stand up and make those speeches appealing to the future, and we want to distract ourselves with the endless inputs of media and the kind of endless numbing tools and technologies and innovations and substances that have been, most of the most successful products of the early 21st century have been ways of numbing ourselves, from opioids to Netflix. And to narrate all of this, to say that world in which it was possible to have that easy confidence of our proximity to the future is gone and not coming back, and doesn't need to come back, because there are other shapes that hope can take that are less costly, less extractive, less devastating than the grand projects of modernity and that way of attempting to flee the past into the promise of the future. But in order to arrive at that, sometimes it may be helpful to talk in this strange language of talking about modernity. Sometimes we need other languages and other stories for talking about it as well. I find myself going back to these lines from T.S. Eliot. I said to my soul, "Be still and wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing." There's a sense of needing to put down the kinds of hope, the forms and shapes of hope that we were promised. And when I look back on the work that I did in the years when I was deeply involved in the Dark Mountain project, part of what we were doing with that, it seems to me, was holding a space in which people could make a journey to the far side of despair. Sometimes it's necessary to pass through despair rather than to try and hold it off at all costs, as if that's what hope looks like. And I think of the conversations I've had with friends who are in AA or other 12-step fellowships, and how, the first step of the 12 steps is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, over our addictions. And there is a move that looks a lot like that is part of what letting go of dead hope looks like. That admission of powerlessness, which strangely is the beginning of transformation, the beginning of a new possibility in recovery. Those kinds of strange moves are part of what's called for now. And so when I look at the people and the projects and the undertakings that give me hope, many of them look very humble. They don't look like the kind of thing on which one could found the kind of hope that modernity taught us to look for. Ivan Illich, from whom I learned so much, used to speak about hope as remaining open to surprise. And towards the end of his life, he would say, the limits of political possibility today are the number of people who can sit around a table and share a meal together. Which is less pessimistic than it sounds at first hearing, because most of us need a couple of meals a day, and we don't all have to be sitting at the same table at every mealtime. And when I found my way to the table of Illich's surviving friends and collaborators, one of the practices that struck me deeply As they said, we always have a candle lit on the table and a spare seat for the stranger who might arrive at the door. And so out of that, I begin to discern a humbler pattern, a humbler shape of hope. And so then I get inspired by talking with Adam Wilson of the Peasantry School, who's a farmer who's been farming for 20 years and for the last 4 years has been, in my language, living under a vow that none of the food that is produced on his farm will be sold for money. And therefore, he has to do the cultural work of getting sufficiently involved in his local community where he is in upstate New York, that he can feed people and be sustained by the community outside of that transactional logic of the market. And part of that work is, meeting and learning from the old people who have lived experience of how much that was part of how life worked in rural America, just like in John Moriarty's rural Ireland, within living memory. So there are people and projects like that that I see as picking up the dropped threads and weaving with beauty. Beauty is very important. When everything is sustained by oil and colonialism and the rest of it, we can live without beauty because our needs are met. We barely need to get out of bed in the morning. It's all brought to us by apps. And as that unravels, we need more meaning and more beauty in order to navigate, in order to make life work. It's a strange thing to say because people often think of beauty and art and culture as luxuries that arrive once the basic needs are met. It's not true. There's a woman called Ellen Dissanayake who has spent her life studying art as a foundational human activity, whatever language it's expressed in. She says you cannot find humans anywhere in history, in the anthropological record, in the archaeological record, who are not doing things that would fall under the name of art in our society. The novelist Alan Garner told me about an encounter he had a long while ago now with a storyteller from Uzbekistan. And he said, he gave me his hat, which was clearly a gesture of intercultural recognition from one storyteller to another, the handing over of this important object of this hat. And he said, and when he was 8 years old, he had been picked out alongside 2 other village boys by the old storyteller. They went and lived in the storyteller's household. They would have been part of the work of the household. They would have traveled and listened to the storyteller and helped him, learned from him. And at the age of 18, the other 2 boys were sent back to the ordinary path of village life. And this one stayed on as the storyteller's apprentice. Around the time he was 40, he was allowed to tell a story in public for the first time. That's how seriously the work of art, the work of storytelling, the work of carrying beauty and meaning has been taken in cultures, in times and places which, according to the standards of our TED Talks and our development rhetoric, are unimaginably poor. And when I tell that story to artists and culture makers in the richest countries in the world, I see their hearts breaking at the gap between the centering of the work of culture in that village in the Uzbek mountains and how precarious and vulnerable and exploited the work of culture is within the societies that are meant to be the ones that are the most developed and live closest to the future. And I tell stories like that because they help us break open our assumptions about the shape of history, the kind of world we're in, the kind of people and culture and society we're in, and how it relates to all of the other ways of being human that exist around it and have gone before it. So, I find hope in a strange collection of places, and I try and pass on these stories in order that people can maybe tune their attention to notice, as I began to notice once I started on this path, things that don't make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending, things you're not meant to take seriously, things you're not meant to build your hopes on if we're trying to think in the way that we were taught to in school. but that might nonetheless be seeds, that might nonetheless be the pockets out of which a landscape is reseeded in the kind of times around and ahead of us. So my old friend Vinay Gupta came out with a thing called Simple Critical Infrastructure Mapping, otherwise known as 6 Ways to Die. And Vinay, comes from a Hindu lineage where death is something that is very much in the foreground and lived with and experienced and reflected on. He wrote a piece for one of the early Dark Mountain books where he told the story of being one of the carriers of the skull bowl. He said, a couple of generations back within my lineage, I would have been expected to carry a bowl made out of a human skull, preferably the skull of my dead teacher. And that's how in the foreground mortality is within his background. And he says, by contrast, white Western modernity is not very good at looking at and thinking about death. So he said, I've been thinking about death for you. He says, so far, I can only find 6 ways you can die. You can die by being too hot, too cold, hungry, thirsty, sick, or injured. And so then he draws this kind of spider's web where you have these lines extending outwards on each of those 6 axes with concentric circles mapping from the scale of the household outwards all the way to the global, the infrastructures and the dependencies which keep you alive on all of those. And I've come back to this lately because once we're starting to talk about what's worth doing to create the conditions of possibility of worlds worth living for in the times to come, the basic conditions of possibility are that our needs on those axes need to be met. And so we need work going on in order to make sure that we can feed ourselves, in order to carry, like Richard Smith taking my 4 tasks for an age of endings in the BMJ and applying it to health and medicine. We need that kind of work going on. But what I said to Vinay is, I think there's a 7th way to die. Because you can have the things in place that give you the conditions of not dying on each of those 6 axes. But in the absence of meaning, in the absence of beauty, in the absence of any imaginable life worth living, you can die of those things. And I think that as the trajectory, as the promise of the paths of progress and development are unraveling in our societies and revealing that shadow side of how the kind of cultural poverty that was the shadow side all along of those trajectories, a lot of people are falling into the void of that inability to imagine lives worth living. And we see it in all kinds of ways. We see it in epidemics of addiction. We see it in the mental ill health amongst young people. We see it in our relationships to technology. We see it in loneliness among the old. And you can go to somebody like Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, writing about his experiences of living through the concentration camps. And part of the story he's telling is that was as terrible a set of conditions as humans have ever had to live through. Unimaginable horrors. And there was nothing that would guarantee your survival under those circumstances. You had to surrender that. But what made the difference between going on or giving up under the worst of circumstances is so often the patterns of beauty and meaning, the things that belong to the world of culture, recreated under the limitations of the circumstances in which they found themselves. And to me, that was reading that book was one of the assurances, one of the testimonies that convinced me that I was onto something with this idea that there is a 7th way to die, and therefore also that in any work that is attempting to address this question of how do we create conditions of possibility for lives worth living and worlds worth living for, it has to be woven through with beauty and with meaning. My friend Brian Eno has a definition of culture. He says, culture is everything you don't need. You need to eat, But you don't need to eat palak paneer or a cheeseburger, and you can hear that and you can go, oh, he's distinguishing between two types of food. You know, the basic essential kind of food and then the kind of fancy cultural layer. I don't think that's quite it. Because you can't go into a restaurant and order food. You always have to order something more specific than that. And what that says is that, you know, the essential is always filtered through the non-essential. Things are always culturally inflected. And there is the non-essential is essential. We don't know how to be human together without the cultural. And again, you know, once you attend to Viktor Frankl, or once you attend to the ways in which humans have made life work in societies and times and places that are unimaginably poor, according to the standards of our development theories and the rest of it, what you find again and again is everything is woven through with the shards of beauty and meaning, with the fragments of it. Even under the hardest and most destroyed of circumstances, this is how human beings make lives together. We don't know any other way of being human together. And therefore, in our imagining what's worth doing now, we can't just do it through the engineer's lenses that can only see the essential and not the inessential. We have to bring art, beauty, meaning to the party, or there's not going to be a party. We need to address this story that says the humans are the devourers, the destroyers, that we are bottomless pits of insatiable desire. It's a story that's deep in the roots of modernity. You know, it's there in Hobbes. It's there in the foundations of modern economics. It's there in the idea that, you know, without either the power of the state or the power of the market, we would just destroy everything. It's there in environmentalism. Very often, within environmentalism, within climate activism, there is operating in the background a kind of assumption that the world would be better off without us. It's not true. That's not the whole truth of the kind of creatures that we are. Robin Wall Kimmerer speaks about this in Braiding Sweetgrass. She says, you know, I ask my young students who've come to study forestry science, the things that she's teaching, I ask them to make me a list of examples of humans having a destructive impact on the living world. And they can fill 3 sides of A4 without pausing for breath. She says, and then I ask them to make me a list of examples of humans having a constructive, creative, collaborative, beneficial impact on the living world. And they sit there with their pens hovering over the paper. And she says it's not because those examples don't exist, but maybe it's because they don't fit the story of what it's like to be human, that is operating in our societies, and that is operating as much within many kinds of environmentalism as it is within neoliberal economics. Different conclusions are drawn from it in different contexts, but the story of what it is to be human there is not questioned. And so we need to question that. We need to have another account of the kinds of creatures that we are, or else we end up with that false story becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is really what we're living, is the self-fulfilling prophecy of the humans as the destroyers. But, you know, we need to remind ourselves that the Amazon is not, as it was imagined by, you know, white environmentalists in the mid-20th century, an untouched wilderness with a tiny human population that's not big enough to have damaged it. The Amazon is a human co-created garden, co-created over many, many centuries by the presence of human cultures within that landscape. Now, it's also currently being destroyed at a frightening rate by certain kinds of human activity. But if we describe that as the consequence of what the humans are like, we say the world would be better off if we retreated to our sustainable cities and lived on bacteria grown in vats, we're telling a false story, a story that, you know, that can't come true. You know, it's founded on delusions. When people like Chris Smage come along and look at the data on which the promises of a farm-free future are based, the data unravels. But we have to ask ourselves, what would it cost? What kind of humbling would it take for us to remember how to show up as not only those who destroy, but also those who are a keystone species, those who contribute to the life of forests, the life of landscapes. And I truly believe that there are more and more people hearing the call to that path now. That there is a movement that doesn't look big enough to be taken seriously because it doesn't scale up, it scales outwards. It operates like the image I get from Illich of the political possibility on the scale of the people gathered around the table sharing a meal, but people moving from one table to another. You begin to see how something can spread and be adopted and adapted without scaling up in that mass production way that we were taught to look for if you were going to make impact. That is happening. People are hearing the calls. Strange alliances, strange fallings into conversation are going on, out of which even now, this late in the story, we might bring more through the bottleneck of all of the destruction that is already written into the story than has seemed likely to many of us around here lately. I remember being 25 years old. I was 2 years out from university. I'd done a 1-year journalism training course. I'd gone to work at the BBC on short-term contracts as a radio journalist. I was offered a staff job at the BBC, which is pretty much as close as you get to a job for life. And the same day, my oldest friend called me up and said, "You know, you always said if the spare room in our flat came free, give you first refusal on it. Well, my housemate's done a bunk. Turns out she's not been paying the rent. The landlord's given us 2 weeks to find somebody else or he's kicking us out. Do you want to move to London?" And so I was presented with this kind of, which pill are you going to take? You know, the career pill or the friendship pill? And somehow, something about the formation that I had had in my childhood had set me up to take the irresponsible path, the path into relationship rather than the path towards success according to the logic of the society I was living in. And so then there I am, I'm 25. I kind of blithely moved to London thinking I would be able to talk my way into freelance work, and found myself within a few weeks exploring the ground floor of the British economy, working in warehouses and call centres, but coming home not mentally tired in the way that I had been when I had been working at the BBC and using my brain all day. So I would sit reading for 8 hours in the evening or sit up having late night conversations with my friend who I was living with. And in those months that followed, I had to begin to ask myself the question, what's worth doing with a life? How do you shape a life when you realise that nothing that is on offer in the careers department at university seems to fit? And what happened to me in those months was that a number of books fell into my hands off library shelves or bookshop shelves that turned out to read like a letter from the older, wiser friend I badly needed at that moment in my life. One of them was John Berger's The Shape of a Pocket, and his letters between Berger and Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas that were in that book. Another one was a book called Soil and Soul by a Scottish activist called Alistair McIntosh, who must have been then about the age that I am now. And he was telling these stories of the land reform movement in Scotland and the campaign that stopped the super quarry at Ronyaval on the Isle of Harris, this activism that he'd been part of. And it deeply impressed me. It was spiritually grounded, but it was also grounded in the sense that it was practical and achieving things in the world. It wasn't driven by anger in the way that a lot of the activism that I had met in my young life seemed to be. And that's the only book I've ever read where I sat down immediately and wrote to the author at the end of reading it. And Alistair wrote back to me, and we kept in touch, and over the years we became friends. And when At Work in the Ruins came out, the first public event that I did was at the Golgale Trust in Glasgow with Alistair and Caroline Ross and Diggy Strang, bringing my book to a place that was sacred to me because I had read about it and felt it through Alistair's writing. And I said to him, I think when you're that sort of age, 25, there are a few things more important than finding a few grown-ups who offer you some kind of example that there are paths through life. It's not that you want to be them or that you want to do exactly what they've done. It's just that they stand for the possibility of living otherwise, of making lives worth living. And you need that in order to find your bearings when you're young and you're starting out, because there are so many things that are capturing your attention, that are telling you what the world is like, what life is like, what's worth doing, that are part of the daze and delusion and trance of a dysfunctional culture. And meanwhile, you're being hit by all of the news about the depth of the trouble we're in, and only more so now than it was when I was in my 20s. And somehow, those of us who are no longer in our 20s need to be applying ourselves, not least to making pockets of habitability, creating places, projects that can be a landing place for a while for folks who are at that stage in life, that can be part of how we help our young people find their bearings, and so that they're able to say to us the things we need to hear from them as well. I've become increasingly troubled by something within the climate talk that I've been part of and that many of my friends have been at the heart of, because we talk about the uninhabitable Earth that we're headed towards later this century if we don't mend our ways and do it really soon. I know full well why we talk that way, but it's come home to me lately that there are plenty of people, not least plenty of young people, who are struggling to find a habitable world right now. And if we were somehow magically to wave a technological wand and fix climate change so that we were off the trajectory to the uninhabitable Earth, but we hadn't addressed the reality that we have what is for many people an uninhabitable world, then we would still be seeing so much of the unraveling and the tragedy and the lostness that is there right now. I don't think that technological wand is going to come along. I actually think that our best chance of salvaging the most of the good and making the world worth living for might come from starting by addressing the uninhabitable world, by creating pockets of habitability, by inviting people into those pockets, by spreading what we're learning. The school that Anna and I have, it's a school that consists of a kitchen table and a story and the things that happen as a consequence of those two humble elements. But we say it's a gathering place for those who are drawn to the work of regrowing a living culture. And there's a lot packed into those few words. And part of what we're exploring together now, in the invitation that we're making this autumn with the school, is what do the pockets, patterns and practices of regrowing a living culture look like? How do we share what we're learning in these pockets and support each other to create these pockets of habitability, to join them up? And what kind of maps do we need now in order to help each other find our way, in order to help, not least in order to help young people find their way to those places, those pockets, those undertakings that give that experience of, I didn't know there were grown-ups like this. I didn't know there were places like this still today, even among all of the chaos and all of the loss and sadness and cynicism that is also part of the world in which we find ourselves. So that's a lot of the work that I find myself called to these days. There was a moment in that extraordinary eruption of the climate movements of 2018, 2019, the moment of Extinction Rebellion, the moment of Greta Thunberg's school strikes, Fridays for the Future, and the way that spread around the world. When I started to notice in the voices of some of the people who were speaking in good heart, with good reason, with good intentions about the depth of the trouble that we were in, I started to notice this kind of note of dark certainty. And I felt like, these are people who would probably see themselves as doing very much the same kind of thing that I've been doing since the origins of Dark Mountain, of trying to speak to the importance of giving up the stories that we no longer believe in, the promises that no longer ring true to us, that people felt obliged to stand up and make at activist meetings and so on. And there was a great power in that moment of this kind of rupture of speaking to the darkness, speaking about grief, acknowledging a certain kind of powerlessness as precondition for the possibility of transformation. When Greta went to the World Economic Forum and said, "I don't want your hope, I want you to panic." It's important to feel those things, to really allow the truth of what we're feeling, to allow the panic rather than suppressing it. But I think we also have to travel through that, because panic is not a good place from which to act. We actually have to find a way to act from stillness. And you arrive at stillness not by suppressing or denying or downplaying those rightful feelings, but by allowing them to do their work, and then where you get to through that. And the note that I was noticing that began to trouble me was this sort of note of dark certainty, where people who maybe thought they had kind of given up and surrendered, was one thing they were holding on to, which was their certainty about how the story was going to end, when it was all going to collapse, what decade humanity was going to go extinct in. It was very strange conversations I found myself hearing and being around the edges of. And so that's where this came from, this thing that I say near the end of the book. Surrender, yes, but don't surrender to a certainty, thinking that you know how the story ends. Surrender to the mystery of these times and of all that is being shaken and called into question. And through that, you can arrive at a kind of agency that is very different to the kind of agency we were taught to look for by this culture, this society, this way of living that we were born into. It's an agency that doesn't require you to have certainty, that doesn't require you to pretend that you have a secret cosmic bargain with the universe, where if we do all of these things, if we complete the checklist and the end of an inconvenient truth, then we can make all the bad stuff go away. It's not going to go away. The bad stuff was there all along. It's part of, we need to compost it. We need to work with it. But we can do that. There is an agency that lies on the far side of despair, but it doesn't look like the ways of acting, the forms of attempting to take control of and manage this living world that we were taught to look for as the direction of hope by the logics of modernity. And I hope that part of what I'm doing is helping people who are on that journey, trying to make sure that we don't just get stuck in mistaking the end of the world as we know it for the end of everything worth living for. We don't just get stuck in a kind of a doom spiral of performative grieving, but that we do the real work of grieving and of allowing ourselves to be changed by that, and of showing up as sobered, as grown up in a way that modernity has not encouraged grown-ups. Modernity has encouraged us to spend our whole lives as children. We can't afford that. Part of what's coming in this trouble around and ahead of us is an initiation, is a passage, a hard passage into a kind of maturity that has been very lacking in these societies that have considered themselves to be the most developed, the most advanced, the most progressive the world has ever seen. So that's the time, those are the times into which we were born. One could have wished for easier times, but it's always that way.